Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey peeps, welcome back. This week's Washington episode is going to be all about Martha, because no history of George would be complete without a dive into the First Lady of the United States. Women tend to be hidden in the shadows of American history, and no more so than the First Ladies of the United States. And while Martha Washington is infamous for being the first of the first, there is still relatively little known about her and her life. So this week, I'm going into the life and times of our First Lady, Martha Washington. Grab your cup of coffee, peeps. Let's do this. Martha Dandridge was born on June 2nd, 1731, on a plantation known as Chestnut Grove in Virginia. Her father, John Dandridge, was a planter who immigrated from England, and her mother, Frances. Martha was one of 8 children, having 3 brothers and 4 sisters. Martha's early life is a bit of a mystery. This is in part because there's no primary source material, and of course, as a woman, she would have no need to have official correspondence that would survive throughout the years. What is known about Martha is that, unlike many women of the time, she was fairly well educated, knowing how to read and write. Her education included lessons on housekeeping, music, religion, and dance, as was typical of the education for women at the time. She was also described as somewhat of a beauty and attracted the attention of her first husband, Daniel Custis. Custis was much older than Martha, 38 to her 18 when they married. Martha must have been quite the catch, as her suitor defied the will of his father in order to become engaged with the young woman. Apparently, Custis's father felt that Martha's station was not up to par and threatened to write his son out of the will if he proceeded with the courtship. Upon hearing of the family turmoil, Martha paid a visit to Daniel's father, and whatever she said appears to have worked, as he later relented and stopped making such a fuss about the relationship. Martha and Daniel were married on May 15, 1750, and took up residence at his plantation known as White House. Not to be confused with the presidential mansion built in 1792, this White House was located along the Pamunkey River in New Kent County, Virginia. I'm pretty sure I said that wrong. I apologize. After settling into domestic bliss, Martha proceeded to have 4 children. Daniel, born in 1751, Frances, born in 1753, followed by John in 1754, and Martha, known as Patsy, who was born in 1756. That is a lot of children in a short time period. Unfortunately for Martha, she seemed to be a bit cursed with death, as her 2 oldest children, Daniel and Frances, both died before the age of 5. The death of her 2 oldest children was followed closely by the death of her husband, who passed away in 1757 at the age of 45. Her husband's death was sudden and unexpected, and therefore he had no living will. As a result, English law stipulated that Martha would be entitled to 1/3 of the estate for her lifetime, and the remaining estate held for her children. Typically, wills set up trustees to handle estates for widows, since women were not considered capable of handling the confusing intricacies of math. However, with Martha, since no said trustee had been named, she found herself in a rare position of being in full control of her husband's estate. Daniel Custis's estate was also quite large, including 17,000 acres of land and almost 300 enslaved individuals. Martha took over management, including writing to Daniel's business associates in Great Britain, notifying them of his death and explaining the business relationship would continue as long as she was happy, and that all business-related matters should come to her attention. Since early death was common in the 18th century, it was not out of the realm of normalcy to be married multiple times throughout one's life, and inheriting such a large estate made Martha quite the catch. After a sufficient mourning period, Martha began the process of looking for a second husband. There are two men who are known to have pursued the young mother of two. The first, Charles Carter, was a multiple widow with 10 children, many still young and living at home. The idea of caring for such a large number of children made Martha a bit apprehensive, and considering that Carter was also significantly older than her, Martha had to really consider whether she could raise that many children given the real possibility of outliving her second husband. The other caller was some random dude named George Washington, I think. I kid. We all know George Washington. But when they met, Washington was not really on Martha's level in terms of wealth and status. He gained a bit of prestige thanks to his service with the Continental Army, but Martha's wealth vastly outpaced his own. But George was much closer in age. In fact, she was older than him by about 8 months and had no children of his own. And George was considered a handsome dude for the day. And while folklore paints a picture of love at first sight, this doesn't appear to hold up in the historical record. Whatever the story, Martha and George seemed to find each other mutually agreeable and were married on January 6, 1759, in the parlor of White House. After their union, the couple moved up to Mount Vernon, where George leased the property from his deceased brother's widow until her passing, when it transferred to his name. The plantation required a lot of work, and Martha wasted no time in rolling up her sleeves and taking over managing the household. This, of course, required delegating duties to the various slaves and making sure the house was ready for visitors at any time. While Martha and George never had their own children, George took on the care and education of Martha's children from her first marriage, constantly worrying about Jack's lack of focus and discipline. It is assumed they tried for children of their own and were unsuccessful for unknown reasons. Perhaps George was sterile, either from birth or as a result of the smallpox infection when he was in Barbados, or maybe Martha suffered too much damage from having too many children so close together. In typical fashion, George always felt it was Martha's fault for their failure to produce their own offspring. Because of course you blame the one who's proven 4 times that she can birth a child. Unfortunately, the curse of death continued to follow Martha, and she would lose her youngest daughter, Patsy, in 1773. Patsy began suffering from what is now believed to be epilepsy at the age of 12, and though Martha and George spared no expense in seeking treatments to improve her health, all remedies proved ineffectual, and Patsy would die from one of her violent fits at just 17. Losing her daughter only increased Martha's concern and anxiousness over the well-being and health of her last living child, Jack. She would continue to hover over him and feel weary whenever they were apart. Shortly after Patsy's death, George received the call to serve his country, working to support the colonists in their cause for independence from the British in the American Revolution. Martha was steadfast in her support of the cause, including boycotting British goods. Martha proved to be a pretty fearless lady, overseeing the Mount Vernon plantation in Washington's absence, though there were credible fears for her safety. But Martha was also dedicated to her husband, and went through inoculation in order to remain with him during the winter in the army camps. Throughout the American Revolution, Martha spent the frigid winter months by her husband's side. It was common to cease hostilities during the winter season due to the inclement weather, and Martha's arrival to camp was always seen as a sign by the soldiers present that the fighting had come to an end for the season. Martha ingratiated herself with the soldiers, often hosting visitors and making them feel welcome, and knitting much-needed socks to keep their feet warm and dry. Martha also spent her time in camp befriending the wives of other Army officials, including Lucy Knox, wife of Henry Knox. Gracious and hospitable, Martha started a social circle of sorts with the other visiting wives, putting themselves to work in support of soldiers however they could. Of the 8.5 years George spent away from home for the Revolution, Martha was by his side for 5 when you add up all of her various visits. Martha was a secret weapon for the Revolution. Keeping the general happy and cared for during the harsh winters allowed Washington to press on in the face of the many challenges facing him as commander of the Continental Army. As Patricia Brady wrote in her biography of Mrs. Washington, quote, "George Washington was the indispensable man to the success of the American Revolution." and Martha Washington was the indispensable woman to him." End quote. This sentiment is supported by Washington's expense logs for the war. Refusing a salary and asking only his expenses be covered, Washington recorded Martha's various visits to his official account. To him, he would not be as great an officer without his wife by his side to prop him up and support his work. It was during these many jaunts to her husband's side that Martha found herself in Philadelphia ahead of the Declaration of Independence. Attempting to wait out the British and see if she could safely return to her husband's side, Martha was in town when the Declaration was announced, and therefore knew ahead of her husband that the colonies had decided to publicly declare their severance with the Crown. Death paid yet another visit to Martha, taking her son away at just 26 years old. Jack, serving as an aide to camp, came down with camp fever and never recovered. Martha was devastated. Her worst fear had come true. She outlived all of her children. Completely devastated and in need of a source of joy, Jack's widow, Eleanor Nellie Custis, allowed Martha and George to informally adopt their two youngest children, Washington Custis and little Nellie Custis. The war over, Martha looked forward to getting back to a private life with her husband and the opportunity to raise the two small children at Mount Vernon. But, spoiler alert, history had other plans for Washington, and he was asked to participate in a convention of the states called to retool the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you listen to my episode on the scheming that went on in the run-up to the convention, then you know that Madison was able to convince Washington to show up. If you haven't checked out the episode, go listen. It's episode 29, titled The Madison Dash to the Constitution. Martha was none too pleased at George's ultimate decision and refused to travel with him to Philadelphia, staying at Mount Vernon to care for their grandchildren. Upon his return, the gossip mills were churning that Washington would be selected as the first president of the newly United States. Again, Martha was not happy. And while she hoped the rumors would prove untrue, the Washingtons received the news on April 14, 1789, that George was in fact the first president and would need to move up to the capital in New York. While George journeyed up to the city to start his official duties, Martha hung back and got herself and the children ready for the move. Arriving on May 27, 1789, Martha took her place alongside her husband at the presidential mansion. A 3-story brick building on the corner of Cherry and Dover Streets, the home was located just 3 blocks from the East River and experienced heavy traffic. While a gracious and able host, presidential life and its many political considerations did not jive with Martha's style. She was more a relaxed individual. However, as the wife of the first president, she was expected to be a bit more formal and was pushed into hosting official social gatherings twice a week. The one saving grace of Martha's time in Washington was her relationships with the political wives also living in New York at the time. Martha became quite close to Abigail Adams, wife of Vice President John Adams, Betsy Hamilton, wife of Alexander Hamilton, and continued to deepen her relationship with old friend Lucy Knox. And a little bit of a side note here, my husband kind of has an obsession with Alexander Hamilton, and he always jokes whenever I say Alexander Hamilton, and I'm not saying it in a song. So, because I love him, here you go, honey. Alexander Hamilton. Okay, back to the show. Both George and Martha were unprepared for demands on their time the presidency would take, and eventually started setting boundaries of who could be seen and when, always being aware of the appearance of preference. They would take the weekends for themselves, often traveling the town via coach on Saturdays and reading and writing letters after attending Mass on Sundays. And though Martha hoped against hope that George would serve only one term, she was unpleasantly surprised as he agreed to serve a second term in an ill-fated effort to keep the country together. Anxious about her husband's health, Martha was convinced a second term would spell the end for her husband. Luckily, Martha was wrong, and George managed to survive his second term, finally returning to Mount Vernon to live out in retirement in March of 1797. However, their retirement proved brief, as George passed away on December 14, 1799, just over 2 years after his presidency ended. He was 67. Martha was devastated at the loss of her partner of 41 years. Immediately upon his death, Martha moved herself up to a third-floor bedroom, sealing off the room and bed she shared with her husband until her own death. Stricken with immense grief, Martha did not attend George's funeral, and there is no record of Martha ever shedding a tear. Numb by outliving all of her children and 2 husbands, Martha retreated to her room at Mount Vernon and let her daughter-in-law Nellie serve as the hostess of the household. The news of her husband's death spread throughout the country, and as a result, Martha was besieged with letters extending condolences and requests for mementos of the father of the country. Martha, imitating her husband's sense of duty, often acquiesced to these requests and was sending so much mail that she was granted franking, which removed the cost of sending parcels. There was even a request to move her husband's body to the capital to lie in state. And while Martha agreed, partisan politics and congressional dysfunction prevented this from becoming a reality. And though her husband's stance on slavery evolved over time, Martha's did not. In his will upon his death was the wish that his slaves be freed once Martha passed away. Of course, this became a source of worry and panic for Martha, who started fearing the slaves formerly held by George would work together to plot her death. After consulting an attorney, Martha decided to grant their freedom, and on January 1st, 1801, 123 slaves were freed. Martha continued to host visitors to Mount Vernon until her own death on May 22, 1802. She was 70 years old. Unlike her husband's public dedication, Martha ensured her funeral would be quiet, lying in her parlor in a white gown chosen for the occasion for 3 days before being interred into the family crypt next to her husband on May 25th. Martha made significant impacts to American history, providing aid and confidence to the man who would become the first president of the United States. Loyal and fiercely protective, Martha guarded her husband and their privacy, burning their letters to each other so the details of their relationship remain a mystery. Though little detail is known, it is safe to say that Martha's influence was felt. In her eulogy, her importance was signified, quote, "She was the worthy partner of the worthiest of men, and those who witnessed their conduct could not determine which excelled in their different characters. Both were so well sustained on every occasion. They lived an honor and a pattern to their country, and are taken from us to receive the rewards promised to the faithful and the just." End quote. Before I sign off this week, I want to thank all of you so much for spending your time with me. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, if that's your mode of listening. It helps spread the word to fellow history peeps and makes me smile for hours on end. I also kind of brag and show all of my friends that people actually do like all my history rants. And as always, you can check out show notes, source material, make episode requests, and learn how you can support the pod by visiting the website at www.civicsandcoffee.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.